Today's lecture, like I said, I'm going to move on. I'll be talking about Central Europe. I'll be getting into, well, I'll talk about the rise of Austria, but I'll kind of get into the Habsburg Empire, talk about that because there's like two of them. They have the Spanish one, and of course, I'll talk about mostly the Austrian one that they have in Europe, and probably won't get to Prussia, but later next week, I'll also talk about Prussia, which is also in Central Europe as well. And then lastly, I'll kind of concentrate on also the Russian Empire that also is another empire that kind of emerges in more in Eastern Europe, of course. Last time, of course, we had kind of introduced the whole Age of Absolutism. I think, of course, I talked about Louis XIV and the rise of the Bourbon dynasty, of course, that took over France. So I kind of went through that and kind of gave you kind of a history of the Bourbons that are major power. The French Empire, which really peaks up till I guess about the 18th century that you have before the French Revolution. Now we're going to shift over, of course, today, and I'm going to, of course, be like talking about the rise of really the Habsburg Empire that we have, of course, which you got really two empires that they have that kind of rise to power. You got the Spanish one, Spanish Habsburg Empire. And then the Austrian one, which they usually call it different names. Habsburg Monarchy or Habsburg Empire is a common name that they usually call it. And I've got maps, of course, showing you what is, I guess, parts of a map of old Europe. I guess a long time ago, going back to the 17th century. You can see here, so you can see that kind of dark purple area that's on the western side to the left of that map where it says France. France, of course, that's where the Bourbon dynasty, of course, develops. But all these areas that are kind of like a lightish purple, especially here and over here, you've got the different Habsburg empires that later emerge. And this is all in an area that's referred to as, I guess they call it, at least that part in the middle, is called Central Europe. Where you've got a lot of these states that emerge later, like Germany and Poland will be the main states you see in that map right there. But really Austria down there on the bottom, like the southern part of Germany, kind of emerges there. They actually end up controlling multiple territories, like where the Czech Republic is, Austria-Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, part of northern Italy. All that area at one point was controlled by the Habsburgs. Down here and to the west of France, like down way over here. Of course, you have Spain over there. Spain at one point controlled a lot of different territories too, as well. Not just Spain, but Portugal, the Netherlands, part of southern Italy as well. So they have all these different states that are in Central Europe that kind of emerge, and they really start kind of coming about, especially sometime around like the 30 Years' War, when all those states kind of start becoming major powers throughout Europe. But the Habsburgs, they go back, they think, to the Middle Ages. They go back a long way. And we'll talk a lot about them, of course, today. Looks like Rohan's also joining us, and also Trevor's also joining us this morning as well. So I want to talk about the first one. We'll kind of get into today and get to the Spanish Empire, the one of Habsburg Spain. That we'll talk about that first, about Habsburg Spain in general. The Habsburg Empire was massive. It was huge. In fact, it was one of the largest empires in the world, I think, since going back to maybe the Middle Ages, with maybe Charlemagne's empire, maybe the Ottoman Empire, maybe compared to that too, in size as well. But Habsburg Empire controlled a vast amount of land on multiple continents: Europe, the New World, the Pacific, and part of Asia. You can see the empire itself. I think I've got maps showing the vastness of this actual empire, but I think I've got a map kind of showing their empire, which this is the Spanish Empire, the one right here, which was in from the 16th to 17th century. And most of Europe, the areas they controlled at one point, at least under Charles V, there's a picture of him right here, Emperor Charles V, we've talked about before. You can see they controlled like Spain, Portugal, southern Italy, Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, pretty much parts of Germany. Of course, in the Holy Roman Empire was controlled by them as well. You can see in the Americas, they controlled like New Spain, which was like, Mexico, part of North America, the Caribbean, Florida, Philippines, and then part of South America. So huge amount of territory the Spanish controlled at one point. They even controlled part of Africa as well. So they were basically on, I think, 5 continents at one point. That's how massive they were, of course, in size. So yeah, right here, Spain and Portugal, Italy, and then like Germany. But you can see, yeah, in the Americas and all that, well, they had, a lot of territory, throughout that region. Yeah, of course, they had for a while, they had all these titles. I'll get to it later, but, many of them, the Habsburgs, like, Emperor Charles V was Holy Roman Emperor, but he was also the King of Spain as well. And he reigned about 1516 up to like the 1550s. And Charles V was the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. There were those 2 rulers, so-called Catholic monarchs of Spain. They're the ones that kind of created the early, kingdom of Spain that'll kind of develop from there, which will become an empire. And he was considered the greatest monarch of the 16th century, controlling vast amount of lands. I told you that, hasn't been like that since maybe the time of Charlemagne, going back to the Carolingian Empire. And the Spanish monarchs, there's about, it's kind of very how many there are, but I guess after Ferdinand and Isabella, there's about 5 or 6 that are rulers that are part of the state. They had Joanna of Castile, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. She was often called Joanna the First or Joanna the Mad, because she kind of went insane, I think, in her reign. And she actually at one point ruled over not just Castile, but Aragon as well. And she was married to this man named Philip the First, who they called Philip the Handsome. He was a Habsburg. And so that's how the Habsburgs ended up taking over Spain, because all their descendants after that were, basically related back through him and the Habsburgs. And they had all these, children after that, like, Charles the First, who became King of Spain. He was also Holy Roman Emperor as Charles V. And then he had a son, Philip II. His son was Philip III. His son was Philip IV. And then down to Charles II. I think it was kind of how they're all related to each other. So yeah, they had like, I guess, at least 6 kings that they had, though I think Philip I didn't really have any real power. I think it was mostly his wife that had all the power, Joanna. Of course, there's an expression that they used to say about the Spanish Empire: the sun never set on the Spanish Empire. And that's where that whole saying came from later. The British used to say that too. The British, say the sun never set on the British Empire. Well, that was originally a saying that they said about the Spanish Empire, because they had such vast amounts of territory throughout the empire overall. I think I've got a slide on Charles V right here. Yeah, he goes back to 1500, but began to take over the realms of Spain in the early 1500s. And like 1506, I think when he took power, and he reigned till up to like 1556 when he abdicated his throne. But his empire was vast. He controlled at one point like something like 1.5 1.5 million square miles, or I guess it would be like 4 million square kilometers throughout the world. So it was a massive empire that he controlled at one point. And Charles had to deal with a lot of things, not just, the conquest of the New World, which he began to do under his reign, but he was involved in dealing with the whole Reformation. I think we talked about this before, how he had to deal with Martin Luther and the Peace of Augsburg and all that, under his reign. So he dealt with a lot of different issues, not just with the Spanish and their empire, but also with issues in continental Europe also as well. Now, what happened, though, if you know about the Habsburgs and all of this, he eventually split the empire in half. He did. He gave like half of it to his younger brother named Ferdinand the First. who became like Holy Roman Emperor, of course, in Germany. And so you end up with these two different, Habsburg, dynasties that control part of the empire. And I think I've got a map showing you the different, halves of it that you've got overall. So you got the areas in red would be like the Spanish Habsburg Empire, basically. So that would, of course, include, you can see pretty much Spain and Portugal at one point. You can see also all these areas at one point. I think the Habsburgs took over Portugal for a while. Yeah, southern Italy, including Sicily, Sardinia, was also included. Part of northern Italy at one point. Netherlands, I think at one point they controlled as well until the Dutch Republic broke away. Some territory you can see that's kind of between France and Germany as well. So all these areas were areas that were in red. And then the other area, which is like, you can see the Spanish one was more like a senior branch, I guess, of the Habsburgs. And then you have the junior branch of the Habsburg monarchy or Habsburg Empire, which was basically controlled from Austria, like Vienna. And so that's an area you're talking about that they mostly controlled. That's in the yellow area. So most of Germany, Bohemia, Austria-Hungary, Transylvania, etc. Well, pretty much southern Germany and northern Italy were also controlled as well. But you can't see in that map all the possessions that the Spanish Empire has, of course, in the Americas, as well, because they got these territories they got all over the world that they had. But Charles V abdicated the throne, stepped down. I think he died right after that. But his son took over, basically, King Philip II. He took over Spain at that point. He was the next Spanish ruler that came to power after that. There he is right there, Philip. He was often called Philip the Prudent, is one of his nicknames. He's often called. And he reigned up to like the end of the 16th century, died in 1598. And he's like one of the peak rulers of what they call the Spanish Golden Age. I think he and his son, Philip III, who comes later. And under him, the Spanish Golden Age was this period of where in the Spanish Empire, there was a lot of flourishing art and literature, poetry, and things like that. Artwork like paintings and things like that overall. And it got to the point where up to like the 18th century where the Spanish Empire, it got as large as like 5 million square miles. Seriously, it got huge. I think that was the peak year, 1780, they say, I guess around the coast of the American Revolution and all that going on in America. But it was a vast empire that they had pretty much up to him, which most of the territories they owned, the Spanish were predominantly, of course, in the Americas, where they were getting a lot of gold and silver, very wealthy, but Spain still declined anyway. Philip was kind of this defender of the Catholic faith. He was big into the Counter-Reformation. We know that. He was trying to counter the Protestantism movement. And so he actually at one point, I'll get to it later, but he married the Queen of England, which was Queen Mary Tudor, or Mary the First, known as Bloody Mary, who died on the throne. And Mary had a half sister named Elizabeth, if you know about that. And so in 1588, he tried to invade England, and his so-called Spanish Armada got defeated. So he's kind of known for that, be it the Spanish Armada, etc. But I'll probably talk about that later, not today. When I get to like the history of England, like early modern England, we'll get more into basically that story, whatever. Now, kind of one more thing I'll talk about the Spanish Habsburg Empire. Well, of course, they had all these different kings I've told you about that they had. They had one more king, of course, that they had that's well known, which is Charles II. He's the last ruler before the Bourbon dynasty came in, because the Bourbons actually end up taking over Spain because the fact that the Habsburgs ran out of heirs. A lot of it was due to inbreeding, which they kind of kept all these different people within the actual monarchy, like a lot of, cousins and all that stuff. And so you end up with all these like deformities. Like, I guess Charles II is very famous for his so-called Habsburg jaw, you may have seen before. And he evidently had a lot of physical, mental problems. He wasn't very good at running the throne. And I think by that time in the late 17th century, most of the state was being run by these powerful noblemen that were under the kings, and the state declined after that, even though they had all this wealth that they had, basically. And because of a lack of heirs, the throne ended up going to basically a cousin of his, Philip of Anjou, who, by the way, happened to be a grandson of Louis XIV, of all things. And of course, it ended up sparking a war, which they later called the War of the Spanish Succession. It kind of pitted like the Bourbon side with Louis XIV and his grandson Philip on the throne of Spain versus all the other powers in Europe, especially the Habsburgs and like the Holy Roman Empire. It was a bloody mess, during that time. And so, but that's how the Bourbons would end up getting control of Spain. And for a while, they did control it for a bunch of years, of course, after that. So that's how the Habsburgs, end up there. But they, like I said, they end up collapsing because of what happens with all these, inbreeding stuff. All right, let me go ahead and move on next. I'm going to, of course, talk about the Austrian side of it, the Habsburg Empire, or they also call it the Habsburg monarchy. It's called all kinds of names. There was, of course, never really an official name that they really called. I think later people would kind of start calling it the Austrian Empire as one of the names they kind of dub it more or less. But the Habsburg Empire or monarchy was this collection of states that controlled mostly parts of like Germany, like the southern part, especially of Germany, which those are the main areas they were kind of involved in, like Austria and Hungary are the two main areas they control the most. They control areas like Bohemia, where the Czech Republic is today, Transylvania, where Dracula's from, and all that, Dracula, northern Italy. At one point, they controlled the Netherlands, like so-called Austrian Netherlands, which most like where Belgium, Luxembourg is basically. They kicked around a bunch of names that they tried to call it. It never really had an official name overall, but I think the common names they called it was either the Habsburg monarchy or the Habsburg Empire. But later names they used too, like up into the 1800s, was Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, kind of a long name, or just Austria-Hungary for short as well. So those are all kind of names that kind of were, basically used for this particular empire. It was a multi-ethnic empire, which is very true. It's one of the most famous ones like that, of course, in Europe, which consisted of all kinds of, different types of peoples or nationalities, different kinds of religions, although mostly Catholic. They had Jews and other people that were not Catholic that was involved in it. Here's a list of them, too. Like, they had Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Moravians, Slovakians, Poles, Slovenes, Serbians, Croatians, Bulgarians, Romanians, even Italians up in the northern part of Italy and all that, like Tyrol, etc. And of course, Jews. They were also living in that part, of Europe overall. So it's like a multi-ethnic, type state. And they say that's part of what collapsed later too. Was because of that issue. And later, World War I, of course, was a big thing that, of course, caused the decline overall. I'm going to concentrate mostly on 17th, 18th century, of course, talking about this empire, that emerges in Central Europe. Leopold I, they usually consider him to be one of the greatest rulers of really this Habsburg state that begins to emerge. He, of course, ruled. He was one of the longest reigning rulers, like 46 years or more in power. He had multiple titles, which all these different Habsburg rulers had all these multiple titles that they were called. The Holy Roman Emperor, which, the Habsburgs had control for like 300 years or more, were in power up to the 1800s. Archduke of Austria, It's kind of like a king, but it's kind of a title they call Archduke or Archduchess. I guess it could be King of Hungary, King of Bohemia, I think later King of Transylvania, things like that. It's always multiple titles that they rule over. A lot of these states were gotten through intermarriage and things like that, and some of it's gotten through also conquest as well overall. You can see a picture there, of course, of Leopold, a painting in the middle right there. He's known for a lot of things. I think I talked about this before, but Leopold was a first cousin, believe it or not, of King Louis XIV of France. They were big rivals, at the time in Europe. So they fought each other a lot in wars overall. His really greatest success, though, militarily, was really in the so-called Great Turkish War, which was a major war that was fought against the Ottoman Empire, which the Ottoman Empire controlled a good bit of the Middle East, but also part of Eastern Europe, up to where Hungary is. In the 1680s, they actually invaded the Habsburg Empire and laid siege to the city of Vienna in 1683. And so, hey, good morning, Courtney. But what happened was, you study about Leopold was kind of instrumental in creating this alliance of states that was called the Holy League or Holy Alliance, which was a pro-Christian alliance to fight against the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, who were Muslim, Sunni Muslim, and they wanted to kick out of Eastern Europe. And so other states came in, like Poland, Lithuania, that's east of Germany. You've got the Russian Empire under Peter the Great, who comes in as well. And they were involved because, I think without them, they would have been overrun because I think for a couple months, like at least 2 months, I know, between about, must be like July to about September 1683, the Turks actually laid siege to Vienna. That Schönbrunn Palace, I think part of it, like the early part of it was kind of damaged. That's why they kind of rebuilt it later and all that. But they had the so-called Battle of Vienna that took place, which is kind of considered one of the pivotal battles associated with the so-called Great Turkish War. Anyway, Holy Alliance forces, which were actually led by Poles. This guy named Jan Sobieski, sometimes called King John III of Poland, his forces rallied with a huge cavalry, one of the largest, I think, ever in European history, and routed the Turks, basically. And so that's going to be vital later because in that war, the alliance forces are going to push basically the Turks out of basically Hungary and Transylvania in those areas. Even Slovenia and Croatia eventually fall afterwards. And so by 1699, you get the Treaty of Karlowitz. Leopold ends up seizing control of all these territories that you're looking at. And so I think he was king of Hungary, king of Transylvania, king of Croatia, Slovenia, etc. And so those are all new titles, I guess, that the Habsburgs kind of add up there with Holy Roman Emperor and Archduke of Austria, etc. So that's basically some of the things that happened as an example under his reign, Leopold. I'll kind of talk about it later, but I think I've mentioned this before. But he is involved in a lot of wars against Louis XIV. In fact, 2 wars: the 9 Years' War, it's got all kinds of names. I think they called it in England and Germany. War that should be War of the Spanish Succession, of course, was another war that they fought as well. 1701, 1713, I kind of mentioned already. And Leopold was instrumental in forming a military alliance against really the French Empire, which originally was called the League of Augsburg in the 1680s. And then I think later they kind of gave it another name, which was the so-called Grand Alliance, which included all kinds of major powers in Europe that were opposed to France. It was an anti-French coalition, which included like Austria was in it, Holy Roman Empire, England, the Dutch Republic, and even Spain joined it as well at one point. And so that was kind of important, that alliance in keeping really Louis XIV in check, like his empire, because I think I talked about how Louis wanted to expand his empire like into Germany, take control of part of the Holy Roman Empire, and maybe mostly the Netherlands as well. And so that's pretty important in checking his power at that time. Now, something I had showed before, which I think, of course, you saw that little short video there, as you know. Of course, Schönbrunn Palace, of course, very, very famous palace, of course, built by the Habsburg monarchs. That, of course, became the so-called central, palace or court, and summer palace, really, of the Habsburg monarchy. And Schönbrunn Palace is really a palace that kind of evolved over time. It goes back a long way, actually, to, I believe, the time of like, I want to say the 1500s, I think, maybe is when it was kind of first developed initially. Yeah, 1500s. And I think it was originally built as a mansion that was called Katterberg under a monarch named Emperor Maximilian II, who used it basically as his hunting ground, kind of like I think Louis XIII had used early version of Versailles as well before Louis XIV expanded into a massive palace. That was the original name. They call it Katterberg. But what happened was there was some kind of nearby spring, like a water spring, where they took water from, or well. And so the word Schönbrunn, which is used today, of course, means beautiful well, beautiful spring. And so the name basically stuck, and that became the name they started using basically by the 17th, 18th century, which you can see right there. It's considered like a late Baroque style type architecture with the actual palace. They call it Rococo, basically, is what it is. It was built over many centuries by various rulers. I think the last ruler that kind of did any remodeling with it, which was Emperor Franz Joseph I overall. But I think that those two are the most famous for doing most of the remodeling behind it. Empress Maria Theresa, we'll talk about later, and Emperor Franz Joseph I, who rules up to about World War I in 1916. And Franz Joseph is famous for being born there and dying there, because he reigned over his empire for like 67, 68 years. He was in power. The palace is known for, a lot of famous musicians came there, like Mozart, you probably heard about, who, give, various, examples of his music, etc. So it's famous for those kind of things overall. It's also famous for its artwork. It's famous for also a lot of its gardens. A lot of the gardens you see there were actually done by a Frenchman named Jean Triet, who was a protege of André Le Notre, the guy that kind of done some of the work at Versailles as well. And so the Great Parterre, I think, is what they call the actual gardens that they put in at that point there. And of course, you saw in the video, it is known for its zoo that they have there, which is one of the oldest that's still working, I guess, today, which you still visit, of course. So I think it was founded in 1752 later on. So anyway, it's kind of talking about Schönbrunn. Of course, big tourist attraction today, kind of like Versailles, of course, overall. And a lot of the artwork is very showy, like in the interior compared to, of course, Versailles. Now, I need to move on and talk about some of the rulers, of course, that who are well known with the Habsburgs, with the Habsburg monarchy, of course. And there's one named Charles VI that's very famous, who came in. He was one of the primary sons of Leopold I. Leopold had two sons that later became emperor. Joseph I was first. He died young. I believe I want to say smallpox, I believe is what it was. So he died young. And then his other brother took over, which is Charles VI, and came into power in 1711. So both were Holy Roman emperors and had the multiple titles also like the other ones had. What he is known for, of course, if you study about Charles VI, he was the last direct male descendant of the Habsburg monarchy, like in Austria, because of the fact that he didn't have any sons to pass, the thrones, to pass the lands on to, basically. And so this became a major issue at the beginning of his reign. He only had two daughters, one named Maria Theresa, the oldest one, and then one named Maria Anna that he had. There's kind of a picture of him on the bottom right there. And so what happened was he came up with this document to basically allow, a female to ensure like inheritance basically of all his lands. Otherwise, what would happen is all these different powers that are, around would come in and try to gobble it up, take all his lands. And so he made deals with countries to accept what he called the so-called pragmatic sanction, which he issued kind of like an edict, basically, 1713. And it basically gave his eldest daughter, Maria Theresa, she inherited all the lands. Became basically its main ruler afterwards. And Maria Theresa, of course, very famously is considered to be one of the greatest female rulers in the 18th century. She's around the same time period as you've heard of Catherine the Great. In Russia, they rule kind of comparable around the same time overall. And she's like the only female ruler that the Habsburg monarchy had, of course, with the Austrian junior branch that we're talking about right there. There, of course, is a picture of her. She had multiple titles. You can see all the list of them: Austria-Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, etc. Of course, later she was, of course, also known as Empress. They call her Empress, Maria Theresa, but that's through marriage, which I'll kind of explain about that. But so she would inherit the whole empire in 1740 when her father would die, Charles VI. She would, of course, be in power for 40 years, 1740 to 1780. And she, of course, would end up marrying, we kind of got a picture of, I think, him right here on the bottom there, but he married this man named Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who became the Holy Roman Emperor. And because of that, she would end up, he being his wife, she was known as Empress, about Empress Maria Theresa through marriage. However, if you know the story about this, of course, about Maria Theresa, her husband was really a figurehead. He didn't really have any real power. Francis I, as he was called, the Duke of Lorraine. He basically, was Holy Roman Emperor from 1745 to 1765, but basically his wife was the one that held all the real power because she controlled all the, the lands and all that. And so what it did do is it started a new dynasty afterwards, because when they had a bunch of children after that, it created this new dynasty that they later call Habsburg Lorraine, or some just call it the so-called Lorraine dynasty that follows, which will reign pretty much after that from the 1780s up to World War I, 1918. They actually had, you can see there, Francis I and, of course, Maria Theresa, they had 16 children between them. I think it was like 11 sons. I think I was right, 11. I'm trying to remember how many it was exactly, but they had 16 children. I know that. 11 sons. I thought it was 11 sons and five daughters. I forget how many it was exactly. But they did have a lot of famous children that were, of course, well known, which were out of those different 16 kids, they had like 3 that were actually rulers at one point. Joe's the second, who I'll talk about today, of course, was considered to be probably the most famous one that ruled over the Habsburg monarchy or empire. Leopold II, of course, was his brother, the brother of Joseph II as well. And then they also had a daughter, of course, of Maria Theresa as well, which was Marie Antoinette. It was originally called Marie Antonia, who later, is famous for being Queen of France. She later marries what would be later the so-called King of France, Louis XVI, and she would become Queen of France in 1774, which she was for almost 20 years. But if you know about later, her and her husband later were killed during the French Revolution. Marie Antoinette, is kind of this tragic queen that's kind of well known, of course, later. A little bit about Maria Theresa. Kind of talk a little about her reign. She was kind of famous for centralizing a lot of the power of the Habsburg monarchy or Habsburg Empire. She was known for reforms also as well. A lot of people kind of refer to her as being like an enlightened despot in Europe. Enlightened despots, or they're also called enlightened absolutists, were monarchs in Europe that believed in creating state reforms to change their state, their government, their society. And so she was known for a lot of various reforms to the state. I kind of have a few things that she did overall, but she did try to modernize the military like a lot of other states were trying to do, like in Germany, like in Prussia, like Frederick the Great, Peter the Great, in Russia, etc. She created a council of state where she had various powerful ministers that would advise her. She didn't really have a chief minister, so she was considered like an absolute ruler, basically. She and her son Joseph II began to revamp the educational system to try to, educate the population. They become more secular later, about that in Austria, etc. She did have a civil law code system as well. That's something you start seeing a lot too in Austria, Prussia, and all these other states in Europe. They start revamping the legal codes and other things like that overall. The beginning of her reign didn't go well. It was kind of unsteady. If you study about when she came into power in 1740, she had to actually fight off an invasion to take over her empire. They had this conflict break out called the War of the Austrian Succession, where a bunch of powers didn't like her being on the throne because she's a female. And so Frederick the Great, I think, was one of the ones that kind of sparked it when he invaded the territory of Silesia, which you can see in that red area of the map at the top right there, which he seized and took from her, by the way, which I don't think they ever got it back. Silesia is kind of like right above Bohemia, you see there between that and Poland. And Silesia had a lot of natural resources, which were kind of important later for developing the Prussian state to the north. She hated Frederick the Great. She couldn't stand him. And I think she once remarked to one of her ministers that evil man, I think is what she basically called him. Now, I think Frederick wanted to marry her at one point as his wife. That didn't work out well, of course. So that's kind of her reign, Maria Theresa overall. Now, I also talk about her son. Her son was also pretty famous as a ruler as well, which was Joseph II. Although he was kind of controversial type figure, Joseph. He was a Holy Roman Emperor as well. After his father died, Emperor Francis I. But like I said, he was a very prolific reformer. In fact, he was considered one of the greatest enlightened despots in 18th century Europe. It might be one of the best examples and greatest one ever. But he was radical. He was radical for his time. A lot of the changes that he was trying to make to the state. Initially, he co-ruled with his mother, Maria Theresa, up to her death in 1780. Now, I think from 1780 to 1790, he co-ruled. He kind of ruled by himself, pretty much as the ruler of the Habsburg monarchy and Holy Roman Empire. And his reforms were often called Josephinism, is what people kind of called it. A lot of the nobility, some didn't like it, some of the changes he was trying to make within the country. And there's a lot you see there. There were some of the major reforms that he was kind of very famous for in instigating. He abolished serfdom. That's something you start seeing a lot in early modern Europe in the 18th century, which some people didn't like that. But the nobility didn't like it after that. But freedom of religion and also civic rights were given to Protestants first, and then Jews. They had this thing come out called the Patents of Toleration. There was one in 1781 to the Protestants and then to the Jews in 1782. And so those groups all began to have rights and all that. And that's kind of something you start seeing in Europe, like the emancipation of Jews throughout Europe and things like that that followed. Also, freedom of the press was something you start seeing. Like there's, they get rid of censorship and things like that in that part of Europe. Reform the judicial system as well to make it more equal. So I guess they're starting to create kind of a civil code system too as well. Abolish torture, abolish the death penalty. These are things that were kind of surprising that they did as well. Expanded state schools. They began to try to educate the population, not just nobility, but other social classes, things like that. Obviously opened hospitals, insane asylums, poorhouses, orphanages, things like that. Parks, gardens, things like that. I think it's under him that he's really the one that kind of expands the whole Vienna Zoo, part of the Schönbrunn Palace, and all that. And so those are all things that he really was big on. And he was also big into music. If you know about Joseph II, he was a big idol of Mozart. You heard of Amadeus Mozart, of course, the famous composer. Mozart, of course, was at one point a court composer under Joseph, but they think that Joseph was kind of too critical toward Mozart. And one time he had done an opera, and Joseph said that it had too many notes in it, the music, or something like that. Made fun of Mozart or something like that. But anyway, Joseph II was kind of radical, for his time. But in parts of Europe, that's something you start seeing where there's a lot of reforms that are kind of going on overall. Now, also, I'm going to talk about a couple other rulers I'll kind of get into as well. It's kind of just mentioned, of course, about this particular empire we're talking about. Yeah, eventually they go away with the Holy Roman Empire. They have like some later rulers that, of course, come in later. Like, Leopold II was the brother, like I said, of Joseph II. He kind of tried to rescind some of the reforms that he was trying to do, but he died in 1792. And then he had a nephew, the nephew of basically Joseph II, which was, I guess, the son of Leopold II. Francis came in, Emperor Francis II, they called him at first. He was Holy Roman Emperor 1792 to 1806. He was actually the last Holy Roman Emperor. The reason why, of course, was because of Napoleon Bonaparte, who rose to power in Europe and became Emperor of France. And his armies invaded Europe and basically forced the Germans to basically dissolve the Holy Roman Empire. So in 1806, it ended. And so after that, you start seeing this new state kind of emerge, I guess, afterwards. They start calling it the Austrian Empire, I guess, one of the names they start kind of using now, I guess, after that, because the main ruler of that state becomes the Emperor of Austria, which at first he was Francis II, but actually the title that he goes by is actually Francis I, because he's the first, Francis of that empire that you have later overall. In fact, here's the list of all the emperors that kind of rule over Austria later. Francis I, who was originally Francis II as Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand I, Franz Joseph I. And they have briefly one at the end named Charles I that also reigns. Basically 4 rulers after that. The state had different names. Later in the kind of late 19th century, they start calling it the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or just simply Austria-Hungary. What happened was in 1867, they created the so-called dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. And this was basically a state where Austria and Hungary had political rights and all that and power. Everybody else did not. If you weren't like an Austrian or Hungarian, you didn't really have any power or anything like that. And so the Habsburgs, after that, Habsburg-Lorraine dynasty, basically the rulers were Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. And I think sometimes they're called Emperor King. I think it was a common nickname that they sometimes called all these rulers. That was kind of talking about after that. They had one more ruler who came later, I'll mention, that was very famous, which was Emperor Franz Joseph the second, they called it. Actually, that should be the first. I'm sorry. That's a typo there. Oops. But yeah, Franz Joseph the first, of course, his name. Anyway, Franz Joseph, I don't know why they call him the first or second or whatever. There's only one of them. But he basically is really one of the longest reigning that you have over the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was in power, by the way, almost 68 years. It's like 67 years, 355 days. Born, of course, originally, like I said, in the Schönbrunn Palace. He died in the Schönbrunn Palace in 1916. And he had a nephew, we'll talk about later, named Franz Ferdinand, who was supposed to take the throne. He was the Archduke of Austria. What happened was he was assassinated in 1914. A guy named Gavrilo Princip shot him. And as you know, it ignited World War I later. So Franz Joseph, is the one that really is the ruler when World War I breaks out. Of course, some people blame that state for really causing World War I breaking out. But eventually what will happen with that particular empire too, that empire will also break up too, following World War I as well. But like I said, the Habsburgs were a long dynasty that goes back to the Middle Ages overall. So there's Franz Joseph right there. But he had I think another relative that took over, Charles I, afterwards. And they still have pretenders of the throne. I think they still have Habsburgs or whatever that still claim the throne, believe it or not. A lot of these countries, like I guess in Austria or whatever, but they'll probably never get it back, basically. So anyway, that's pretty much part 2 lecture, of course, on the Age of Absolutism. Of course, now later next week I'll be moving on to talk about Frederick the Great, and the rise of Prussia. That's our next topic, of course, part 3 lecture next week. And I'll do that. And then we'll have also a part 4 lecture I'll have as well, which will be on the rise of Russia. I'll kind of talk up to like Catherine the Great, Peter the Great as well. Some of those great czars they had in Russia. So that's pretty much it for the week. Don't forget, like I told you before, I think we had some assignments that were, of course, out there. Of course, the exploration quiz is still open. I'll have that open maybe a little longer for you to kind of wrap up. But of course, you do have that new one on the conquest of America to, of course, start working on. That's due next week as well. You can also start working on your second vocab. Don't forget. But if you didn't turn the first vocab in, make sure that you, of course, send that to me. If you have any comments, questions, of course, about this lecture, let me know, of course, later on my channel. Like anybody had any live questions, of course, today. But that's it for today. I hope everybody has, of course, a great weekend coming up. And yeah, I hope you kind of enjoy this cool weather that we're having, right now. It would stay that way forever, So y'all take care and have a, great rest of the week.